welcome to all our viewers for our final show of this season, the 10th show, the 10th episode of season one of AWA Agora. There are several um, uh, there are several faces here that have been regulars with us, and I really appreciate you coming for the talks and also for our Zestival that happened last Saturday. At AWA Agora, we have been working intently on facilitating thought leadership through a dialogue, a live dialogue here on Zoom, which then goes into post production and is posted onto our YouTube channel. So please remember to subscribe, click on the bell so you get the notifications, and follow us. And definitely, if you can, please post it on your social media channels. Today, we have a wonderful speaker, Thomas Vonier. He is an architect. He shuttles between Paris and Washington, D.C., and he's the president of the International Union of Architects, also a past president of the AIA, which is the American Institute of Architects. That was in 2017. I had the pleasure to meet him at an AIA International Region Conference in Toronto in 2016. Um, and I loved his his research, his thoughts, his work that he does all over the world. It was really inspiring. We had great conversations. He gave great feedback on my presentation, which I incorporated going forward with the whole topic about culture. He also wrote the introduction to our book, Contextualizing Light, that was released 6 months ago. So I've had the pleasure of knowing him, of seeing his work, being inspired by it. And today it's my pleasure to host him as a guest on our show. So, Tom, welcome. How are things
Thank
with
you,
you?
Abhay. Yeah, very well, thanks. I'm delighted to be with you. Thank you for the honor of having me join your program. Hello to your team in New York and New Jersey. Hello to your uh, loyal viewers. I'm really happy to be here, Abhay.
That's fantastic, Tom. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for taking the time. I know it's holiday season and you have a busy schedule all the time. So I appreciate you taking
Uh,
the time to meet with us. Um, uh, I would love to talk to you about your work, you know, the global challenges that you're experiencing through these times of COVID. And I know you have
yeah,
pulled together some wonderful slides for us.
well, that's kind
So
of you.
So we would love to hear more on these global challenges and how things are pivoting during COVID.
Well, let's
And
start with that. Let's start with talking about global challenges. I see three factors that are going to be influencing our work as architects and physical designers for, I think, the balance of our lifetimes. And none of these are unfamiliar. If Justin can start running slides, I think, first of all, it's no surprise that almost everywhere in the world we're experiencing extremes of weather, almost everywhere. This happens to be a photograph of a portion of Florida on the eastern seaboard in the United States. If we had more time, I'd show photographs of flooding. Let's move on, Justin. Next one, please. So the first factor that I want to just strike out is the fact that everywhere in the world is experiencing extreme weather at one time or another. Next, please. Where I live in Paris, France, last summer, the temperatures reached 108 degrees Fahrenheit. There had never been a temperature that high on record. Temperatures all across Western and Eastern Europe soared into extremes that have never been seen. And one of the factors that is so important, I think, for urban design and for architects is the reflective properties of uh, cities and efforts made to now try to avoid absorbing that heat and reinforcing that heat and creating heat sinks in urban environments. Next, please. The the other second factor, let's move on from this dramatic Manhattan photo, is really about the world we live in. If there are 7.5 people on our planet, a billion people on our planet, something on the order of a billion, and perhaps more than that, perhaps twice as many as that. Next slide, live in places that they build for themselves. They use materials that are scavenged. They build with whatever is at hand. And next, please. We see cities that have all mega cities all across the southern hemisphere, particularly, that have this character. Next, please. And so these megacities have a dichotomous sort of divided nature. Next, please. Where we have education next to ignorance, safety next to danger, a designed environment next to a chaotic one, and poverty next to wealth. And the physical character of our cities, please continue, um, takes on this sort of dichotomy. Here's a photograph of the largest slum in Africa, Kibera, which is in Nairobi, Kenya, perhaps one of the largest in the world. Estimates are that as many as 2 million people live in this so-called informal settlement. They actually use the term slum for it. So next, please. And the third factor after, next slide, has to do, of course, with the pandemic we're all experiencing. Next, please. And that is now a global factor, just as climate and the sort of plight of the impoverished is a global factor. Next, please. And it's begun to affect physical environments in a profound way, and even the marketing of buildings. And I'll come back to this. Last slide for this segment, please. So I just want to conclude this sort of framing of global challenges by saying that we live in a world in need, Abhay, and I'll come back to that when we move into the next segment.
Fantastic, yeah, fantastic. Thank you for sharing this with us. But there's this work that you do with the International Union of Architects, the UIA. How does it really, how does that as a group, as an association, address these aspects that you just showed? That 1 billion people, 1 billion people out of 7.5 billion have constructed their own dwelling, not an architect,
That's right.
you know. So how does the UIA kind of plug in and stay relevant with an evolving world order? Because it's not the AIA, it's the International Union of Architects.
That's right. Well, I want to talk about its origins just briefly.
Sure.
I think that's instructive, and I'll come back to your question. Let's move on then, Justin, with this a little bit. This whole idea of a world in need is actually what gave rise to the International Union of Architects. It was formed in 1948, 72 years ago, really in the aftermath of the Second World War. Let's move through these slides kind of quickly, Justin. And, the cities were in absolute ruin, especially in Western Europe, but not only in Western Europe. And that is really what motivated a group of 27 countries to meet in Lausanne, Switzerland, and to form the International Union of Architects. It was one of the first organizations to openly express this idea that architecture could help to improve society, the human condition, and the condition of our planet. The first president was this man, if you'll go to the next slide, Auguste Perret, who is the father of reinforced concrete, a Frenchman. He was the first president of the UIA, and people may remember him because he restored the city of Le Havre in France. He rebuilt that city, which had been bombed into oblivion by the Allied forces toward the end of the Second World War. A very interesting place now on the UNESCO World Heritage List because it is such an interesting city and built by his hand. For many years, if you'll move on, the UIA was in his apartment in Paris in the 16th arrondissement. That we moved in there after his death, and his family was very gracious and allowed us to use those offices for several decades. Then we move along. When the apartment changed hands, we moved into this building where we are now, the tallest building in Paris. the
Hmm.
Tour Montparnasse on the 47th floor. Many people think it is the ugliest building in Paris. One of the great things, though, is that once you're inside, it is no longer ugly. You can't see it, and you get the very best views of the city. Let's move along. So here are the purposes for which UIA was founded, and I'm going to dwell on the middle one in the last part of this
Hmm.
talk. But I think to address your point and your question, UIA has always tried to focus on the pressing social and environmental needs of society and the planet from its inception. And we work very closely with UNESCO and UN Habitat. We have formal agreements with them to support their objectives in preserving heritage, in
Hmm.
trying to resolve housing crises and housing problems. We have been part of Habitat 1, Habitat 2, Habitat 3, which are global gatherings of people interested in and devoted to trying to improve housing conditions in particular. Um, I think of the work of people like Alejandro Aravena in Chile,
Hmm.
Francis Queré in Africa, as how illustrating how a design intellect, how people who have brilliant design instincts can intervene in situations that uh, had they not been present, would not be as successful as they really are. Aravena's project that I think of in particular is for Chilean copper miners. He built a very basic set of infrastructure that allowed plumbing, potable water, sewage, and sanitation, recognizing full well that the miners would build for themselves at the pace they could with whatever materials they could find whenever it suited them. And so, in the end, what you get is something that you would not find on the cover of a design magazine necessarily, although when he won the Pritzker Prize, it did, in fact, get on the cover of magazines. But it's a case where an architect's brilliant sort of conception and intervention
Hmm.
created an underlying set of conditions that allowed people to sort of build for themselves with a result that was much better than would otherwise have been the case. And Francis Queré from Burkina Faso in Africa,
Sure. Yeah.
very similar set of ideas about using native materials, indigenous labor, and the sort of resources at hand, but with the intervention of a design intelligence to build a product in a way that's better than would have been the case otherwise, making a real difference in human lives. You may know he's built
Yeah.
schools and clinics, and they've
Hmm.
all been built by the tribe from which he originally came, using local materials.
Sure.
So we try, now we've embraced in the UIA the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the
Uh-huh.
United Nations. I suppose you're familiar with those.
Mhm. Mhm.
And we have published with our Danish members section a guide to those 17 sustainable development goals, showing architectural and urban design projects all around the world that address every single one of the goals, from the eradication of poverty to lifting women into roles that are more substantial and meaningful, to creating safety and health and education. And you and your subscribers can obtain this guide free of charge in PDF form through our website on UIA. It's easily found on Google, the International Union of Architects, and you can track that down quite easily. So we've tried, I think, all through the years, and certainly during my term in office, to show how architecture and good design can make a difference for the most pressing needs that we face. And certainly extreme climate, the need for housing, and now a global pandemic are all factors in which architecture and design can make a real difference and have a profound impact. So
That's
that's what we try to do.
well. I have a related question, right? To what you were just speaking about. We had a guest called Martha Schwartz a few months ago. You know her. She's a great person. I love her dearly, and very good designer. And She didn't want to speak about landscape. She only spoke about climate change, how it's so real, and how the migration that happens because of, you know, people moving. And you're talking about urban migration, not necessarily cross border refugees, but within a context. So you have climate change and you have migration. Those are the two things that you spoke about in a big way. And asking the big question, that how do we stay valid, how do we stay relevant as architects in this evolving world order, right? Which of course has been compounded by what the pandemic has done. All of us are looking at the mirror, talking about, how to pivot and do things differently. But in your thoughts and in your work, you've traveled all over the world. Your exposure set is tremendous. Would there be like one or two things that you would say to people, that say to architects who are listening to this recording, or to students who are studying, saying that, folks, listen up. This is what the future is telling us, you know, and be cognizant. If there are two or three or one point that you would kind of
Well,
say.
I think
Yeah.
you're right, Abhay, to focus on the problems of migrating populations and to identify the fact that there are internally displaced people, there are refugees, climate refugees, refugees from conflict,
Mhm.
and refugees from starvation and poverty all over
Mhm.
the globe. And this
Right.
is a factor that is affecting lives everywhere. You mentioned the Rohingya camps earlier. We visited those last year, and I was amazed to see the interventions that clever architects are making simply in efforts to improve basic living conditions through ingenuity and finding out how to use materials and supplies that are at hand in creative ways, using their discipline as designers and the insights that people who gravitate to architecture tend to have that ordinary people might not. And
Right.
so I think, if you're an individual who is inclined to try and help others and who wants to devote time and effort to making lives better for other people. There are ample opportunities all over the world for ways to be involved. We're not going to resolve the problems that are at the root of these
Sure. Yeah.
issues alone. I mean, that's clearly not the case. You put me in mind when talking about climate change of two things. One, yes, we have a role in trying to mitigate the factors that have exacerbated and created such conditions. It's all about our development patterns and automobile dependence and trying to
Mhm.
diminish all of that. But we also have a role in trying to, let's say, guard against the effects of those and trying to cope
Right.
with them. I showed that picture of Manhattan flooded early on when Hurricane Sandy hit the island. Anyone who was there at the time would know that there was
Yeah.
very substantial damage done in areas along the Battery and
Yeah.
east and west side that had never really been experienced since
Yeah.
the island has been developed. And the initial reaction was the Corps of Engineers' idea was to build a gigantic seawall around the base of Manhattan. These are the people who brought us the levees in New Orleans. And
Yeah.
you can say what you
Yeah.
will about the engineering mentality, but I don't think that was a particularly promising idea. And it took an architect, Bjarke Ingels, and Big, to
Yeah.
think about an alternate way to not necessarily create designs that would diminish the generation of factors that affect the climate, but to cope, simply to cope with the effects of climate change. So that big U project for the southern
Mhm.
tip of Manhattan was a very different conception, basically saying, look, when the sea levels are where they're supposed to be, we can use this as recreational space. It can be used in a different way to create amenity for people who come to that area. And then when sea levels rise, as they inevitably will, I think we know that, we can sacrifice certain areas and allow them to be impacted and protect those areas that are further into the island. So uh, I think as designers apply their ingenuity and their thinking to these
Mhm.
problems, we're going to be better off because we'll see solutions that would not have come forward otherwise. In the few minutes, I'd like, when we can, to talk about public infrastructure because I think in the United States in particular, we're now poised when we resolve some of the other issues that are before us, and particularly the pandemic
Mm.
and coping with the pandemic and trying to stem the rates of infection. We will be able to turn toward questions about how do we invest in our future and how do we build
Ah,
what I call public infrastructure in a way that is constructive and supportive of the way we want to live, not the way we live now, but the way we want to live.
want to live, yeah. Fantastic. Let's do that. Let's jump right into your next
Okay.
step.
Well, I talked about the role of UI in trying to influence policies. And what is policy? Justin, if you'll move along through these, it's really just a set of principles that guide our actions. That's what policy is. So I want to talk about principles, which are, I would say, drawn in my mind from motivations about how we want to improve lives for all people. So much of our development is a result of the automobile and the potential that the single passenger vehicle created. And you can take a photograph like this almost anywhere in the world. It can be in the African subcontinent, the Indian subcontinent, the African continent. It can be in South America. It can be in New York City or New Jersey. We have just allowed this mode of transit to dominate our way of life. And when people talk about infrastructure, they tend to focus on roads and bridges. And when you hear people talk about infrastructure, those are the things they mention. But it should include all aspects of the basic systems we need to support our way of life. And I want to elaborate on that a little bit. Sometimes when people mention infrastructure, they do talk about canals and inland waterways. As we move on, they talk about railroads and the infrastructure which exists still in some parts of the world to move people by rail. But we have to focus not so much on the remnants of the 19th century and what's left of the 20th century apparatus. We want to focus on how we wish to live and not necessarily on how we once lived or how we live today. And to me, that means focusing on modes of transit that favor pedestrians, that favor cyclists, that favor lightweight vehicles. And that requires more than just making pathways. If we can move along through the slides, I think everyone has had experience with these dockless scooters. And, here are the PR pictures. Here's the reality.
Right.
Um,
Mm.
everywhere you go, especially where dockless bicycle systems have been created, you see the results of kind of a careless and not very heavy investment in the infrastructure needed. I'm going to dwell on this for just a minute. This is
Please.
the Velib system in Paris. Much more sophisticated, much more expensive docked system. That is, every bicycle is accounted for digitally. It has to be docked in order to be
Mhm.
registered. Let's move through these. And that requires a real investment. This little machine that I've circled, you'll see in the next slide a guy using it. You have to have a card
Mhm.
that allows the bike to be unlocked and to move away. When you take it away, it's automatically logged out. So that infrastructure is very important, just as dedicated roadways and paths are very important. Stop on this slide for just a moment. One of the things that's so interesting about our urban technology now is the fact that many bridges were built in a structurally redundant way without initially any provision for bicycles or pedestrians. And the fact that they're structurally redundant and in a sense over-designed means that it's relatively easy and inexpensive to come back and add something on to an existing structure without having to build the entire thing anew or to go under a tremendous sort of renovation in order to be able to make it usable by the pedestrians. Let's move on. So I think what we need to remember about infrastructure, and Paris, where I live, is such a wonderful example of this, is that it's the basic amenities, the basic elements, physical pieces of equipment
Yes.
that are designed to enhance the urban experience, to create amenity, to allow people to enjoy and pause and take advantage of the city. And it recognizes that it is not just a place for movement, for the exchange of goods, for work, for business, but a place where it can be enjoyed. There's a wonderful photograph from Atjeh that to me kind of embodies the very ideas that you read about when you go back to Haussmann's era and the thinking that was at hand about how to design a city. And this goes back even further before Haussmann's time, with architects and urban planners asking themselves, well, how far should a family live from a park where they can walk? How many flights of stairs should a parent have to climb with groceries and children in order to reach a dwelling? What is the proper balance between green space and sort of space that's dedicated to roadways? And when they did that, they created these environments that are very humane and really, I think, are part of the absolutely essential infrastructure that cities must have and communities must have, so that people of all ages, people of all levels of ability, and all stations of economic life can have access to amenity and recreation within reach. And to me, that is the purpose of infrastructure, and something I hope that a new administration, we'll have a new Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg in the United States, who I think is sort of on board with trying to favor something other than the internal combustion engine and the automobile, and to try and create a public infrastructure for transit that will do some of the things that I've talked about.
Right.
So I hope that makes sense. I hope that's something that resonates with people.
Definitely resonates with me, and thank you for mentioning about the new administration, because one of the questions that came in while as a direct message to me was, since we were talking about the UIA, that does UIA support the Paris Climate Accord, and will America rejoining be a big help moving it forward? There's certain assumptions here that we will rejoin,
Yeah.
etc.
Well, yes, and I think my answer was certainly the UIA itself as an organization has been fully supportive. I was present for the Paris Accord. UIA, in fact, organized a full day session for the delegates to the COP21, where the Paris Accord was signed,
Right.
devoted to showing how architecture and buildings could help meet some of the objectives defined by COP21. And I think, yeah, we went on to be at COP22, 23, and I think 24 is the one that was postponed or moved to Madrid at the last minute,
Right.
Because of the pandemic. And so we did not participate in that, but we are very much involved with providing information to the national delegations, because COP21, it's a conference of the parties under the United Nations Climate Accord. So the people who go to these conference of the parties are actually government officials from the countries that belong to the accord.
Right.
And yes, I hope the United States will rejoin. I think that will help create pressure on some of the other countries who must help in this, because it is a global challenge. to meet their objectives. When the United States walked away from that, I think it sent a signal to certain countries that, well, if they don't meet the objectives, why should we?
Why should
And,
we?
it's sort
Yeah.
of a step away from the international accord that is really needed.
Right.
I realize, and I think most people do, that there are many problems associated with meeting those objectives and many challenges, and that one country's behavior is not going to make enough of a difference. Everyone has to be
Japan.
committed and involved.
Yeah.
So I sure hope so.
You think that China and India, with the populations and the number of cars that both countries now have, that they would actually also be inspired to kind of do more once we get back in to the accord? I
I
mean,
think that's a
it's a
very
hypothetical, but just
hopeful. I
wondering.
think that's a very hopeful idea.
Uh-huh.
I think I've had an opportunity over the last 3 years to spend a good deal of time in China and a little bit of time in India. In China, I was very impressed with the commitment that has been made to the development of electric vehicles. And there are some cities, new towns with millions of people, 4 or 5 million
Right.
people, where internal combustion engines are not permitted at all. And so every vehicle you see, thousands of them, are battery operated and electric. It has its own problems. I mean, the batteries are uh, based on a sort of poisonous set of materials. Electricity itself is not without difficulty, especially where coal is being used. But I think when you see the results of political will exercised to create this or meet this objective, you say to yourself, well, it could be done if we really wanted to make that commitment. And I think the United States will move toward more focus on electric vehicles. I think the appointment of Jennifer Granholm as the Secretary of Energy, she came from Michigan
Right.
and led in efforts to try and move Detroit and the automotive industry more toward battery-based and electric vehicles. I think we'll see that. India, I know less about. I know less about the commitments being made there. I do know from my travel there that it is a place with enormous challenges of every kind.
Yeah.
But again, a place of incredible industry and amazing ability to accomplish when an objective has been set. And I find that to be very encouraging.
Yeah, I think it'll be really interesting to see how it evolves over the 2021, especially how the policies come back into place. And there are many companies now on the stock exchange which are just making, of course, Tesla being the big one, but then you have
Yes.
another 10 companies that are
Yeah.
trying to jump on. GM, believe
Yeah.
this, is
Yeah.
kind of jumping on it. They were trying to do a tie-up with Nikola, and it's a really interesting time for how the industry is going to evolve and how that will impact our work. And that actually is a perfect segue to a question asked by a friend here, Eva, from who's dialing in from Amsterdam. Is that when are we going to uh, only walk and cycle, no roads and not fly?
Yeah.
So I love the poetry behind it, but I would love to hear your thoughts on real, concerns in terms of what the future may hold here.
Well, I think, that's a matter of public demand. I saw a photograph just this week, coincidentally, of Amsterdam taken in the 1960s, and it was jammed with automobiles. You could have thought it was downtown Delhi.
Mm,
It was, I don't know what part of the city it was in, but it was a photograph taken during the height of rush hour one day in the 1960s. And look what has been done just through public will and the devotion to certain principles in 40 short years. Will we ever move away from the uh, passenger vehicle? I
yeah.
don't think so. Not in my lifetime. but certainly we can
Yeah.
create better balance. And I see in Paris the efforts that Mayor Hidalgo has made to try and diminish the impact of automobiles and to try and give back some of the territory taken by roads to people on foot and people on bicycles. And it's very positive. Once people experience it, they see the value. And one of the, if you can say it, benefits of the pandemic has been the reduction of traffic, and dramatic reduction of traffic.
Yeah.
The air is cleaner, it's quieter, it's safer for children and elderly people. It's a very positive aspect of what has happened with the shutdowns. And I think people see that. I watch young people playing in the street and
Mm.
people moving in the parks and on the sidewalks, also in Washington, D.C. People are enjoying the outdoors more than ever before. Partly it's been forced upon them,
Right.
but it's it's something to behold. And I think if I had to sort of speculate about what the lasting impacts are going to be of this pandemic, I think one of them is that the outdoors will be more important and outdoor recreation will be more important. And I think that's a very good
Yeah.
thing.
In fact, connected to that, in our neighborhood, I live in the historic district of Jackson Heights in Queens,
Huh?
and they've taken all of 34th Avenue and closed it from Junction Boulevard to 68th from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. No cars, and everybody loves it. Loves
Yeah.
it. There are few, very few. I attended a community board meeting where they were talking about losing so many spots, but I would say 95%, 98% of the people were just really appreciative of the fact that they can, from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., the whole street, the 40 blocks of it, you know, is just open for the public to walk and hang out. Sitting on the island, and traffic island in the middle. Hey,
Yeah.
beautiful scenes. People
Yeah.
making graffiti or chalk sketches on the road. Kids kind of playing, and uh, I wish that we would have more of that rethinking here, at least in New York City. I know that Mayor De Blasio has been trying to do that, but not getting into politics. The point is that I think there's a lot more that can be done, right?
I do
And
too. And one of the things, Abhay, that we've seen here in Paris, right now the restaurants and cafes are closed. Everything is closed, and that
right,
will remain into January. And we're hopeful that conditions will allow them to reopen. But just before the new sort of shutdown, um, the mayor here had allowed merchants and restaurants and cafes to take over portions of the street, not just the sidewalk, which has been the case in Paris for centuries,
right,
but now portions of the street where automobiles would typically be parked, or in some cases even moving,
right.
so that there could be more space for people outdoors sitting further apart from one
Yeah,
another.
yeah,
And
yeah,
I think that had a very transformative effect. I think people saw for the first time, oh, well, we could actually, it could be a lot nicer. We could have a lot more amenity if we didn't devote every available space
yeah.
to
I,
motorcycles, cars, scooters, and trucks. So I think it's a something that's coming. I hope so.
I think on the state side, though, the love affair with the car, and the amount of money that's invested by the big car manufacturers, while they change to an electric or hydrogen-based system, there will be some amount of reticence, reluctance to kind of embrace it wholeheartedly. But I think it'll be a very exciting time after the crazy year that we've had this year.
Yeah.
That as we get into 2021 with a new administration here in the United States and changes happening world over, see what kind of comes up, yeah, and how the role of the architect, a forward-thinking, innovative architect, changes or is tweaked based on the stimulus or the stimuli that come in from different backgrounds. Yeah. Fantastic. There's a follow-up thing which just as an FYI that young families are in Holland. Young families are moving out of the city to the countryside. You know, and that's happening in fact in New York City as well. I mean, the real estate value of apartments in Manhattan is gone down about 5 to 10%, as against going up every year as it does. That's because most people are moving up to the Hudson or going into Long Island or parts of New Jersey. I believe Justin was telling me that his broker said that houses that would sit on the market for 6 8 months are moving in 2 weeks, because
Mm.
people are moving out and going into garden districts, etc. So yeah, it'll be wonderful to see how things unfold. I'm very excited for 21. The vaccine is here. Things will be better. We'll all get back to, like, meeting each other, because I mean, I definitely miss one-on-one conversations. And I do have one question, though. I know we are kind of out of time, but this question came in early. Um, uh, where is it? Yeah. What is UIA's top focus for a change in climate policy? What is your main focus on the UIA? And I have a related question. How do we become a member of the UIA?
Yeah.
What's the criterion, etc.?
Well, let me take the first one first, the second one first. UIA is an association of national organizations. So for the United States, the American Institute of Architects is the member of UIA. We don't have individual members, that's under discussion. But right now, it's the RIBA in Great Britain, it's the French National Order of Architects, it's the Indian Institute of Architects, it's the Architectural Society of China. And it's these national bodies, most of them voluntary professional associations, some of them regulatory bodies. They are the members of UIA. And it's structured very much like the United Nations in a
Nations. Yeah.
sense. We have official languages, 6 of them. We meet in a World Congress every 3 years. The next one will be in Rio de Janeiro in July, inshallah. And uh, we're going ahead for sure. It may be smaller than had originally been anticipated, but it is going ahead. And we had one in Seoul, South Korea, the last time, Durban, South Africa. There have been 20 or 30 of them over the years in all the major cities of the world. Um, and there is a general assembly that takes place during those congresses that, where the national delegations have their flags and their microphones and their
Yeah,
translation
yeah, yeah.
sets and their arguments. It's just like the United Nations
Like
in
the
that
UN,
respect.
yeah.
Yeah.
Just going to
Um,
see those debates, yeah, which are
but
fun.
we
Yeah.
tend to support UN Habitat and the climate accord that the United Nations has enunciated, because that is probably the best expression of global resolve to address these matters and to eliminate as much as possible political discord from sort of the resolve to do something. And
Mm.
so we support efforts that are made to transition to renewable sources of energy, to build high quality buildings that are conservative of resources, to transition to materials that are less harmful to the environment, and to try and create patterns of development and growth that are not so destructive to the environment, that don't encroach on agricultural land, that do not usurp natural land in a destructive way. So those are the priorities from a climate change standpoint, trying to focus on what architects and urban planners can actually do, and to try and focus on our domain, and not to give other people lessons about what they should do, but sort of try to make our house in order, if you like.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Well, thank you, Tom.
My
Great
great pleasure.
conversation. Good to
Yeah.
have you here, and thank you all for your questions, and your participation and your attendance. Thank you, Justin, for running another beautiful show on from a production standpoint. This is our final show of the season. Happy holidays, Merry Christmas, Happy Kwanzaa, Happy Hanukkah, and hope you have a beautiful holiday season. Thank you again, Tom. Hope to see you on stateside really soon.
Thank
Safe
you.
travels, and Happy New Year to everyone and you.
Thanks so much. Be well.
Bye.